At long last, I am able to say a few words of my own. I have found it impossible to carry the heavy burden of responsibility and to discharge my duties as king as I would wish to do, without the help and support of the woman I love. In 1936, a king faced an impossible choice: his crown or the woman he loved. This is the story of how a forbidden romance with a twice-divorced American woman led King Edward VIII to risk his entire empire. It triggered a crisis that shook the British monarchy to its very core and forever changed the course of history. This single choice, this one great love affair, wouldn't just cost a king his throne. It would also, completely by accident, set the stage for the longest reigning monarch in British history, Queen Elizabeth II. It's a story of tradition clashing with modernity, of public duty versus private desire, and it remains one of the most unusual and consequential royal marriages the world has ever seen. Before he was the king who threw an empire into chaos, he was David, the Prince of Wales, the world's most eligible bachelor. Born in 1894 as the eldest son of King George V, Prince Edward was groomed from birth to one day rule over a quarter of the globe. He was handsome, charismatic, and had a modern style that felt perfectly in tune with the Roaring Twenties. After serving in World War I, he became a global superstar, a symbol of a new, less stuffy generation of royalty. His tours were met with roaring crowds, his fashion was copied by young men everywhere, and his face was on everything from magazines to teacups. To the public, he was the perfect fairy tale prince, but behind palace walls, a very different picture was forming. Edward felt trapped by the rigid rules of royal life. He found the endless ceremonies boring, the stuffy protocols suffocating, and his father's traditional views hopelessly out of date. He was restless, rebellious, and deeply resented the gilded cage he lived in. He even said his royal duties were a waste of time. And that rebellious streak, it really came out in his love life. Despite being the most sought-after man on the planet, with a long line of suitable aristocratic ladies to choose from, Edward had a thing for married women. His long-term mistresses, like Frida Dudley Ward and Thelma, Viscountess Furness, were both married socialites. This wasn't just a phase, it was a pattern. Edward was drawn to women who were, by the standards of his time, unavailable. In a way, they were safe. They offered him affection without the looming threat of a royal marriage, an institution he seemed to truly dread. This taste for the unconventional was a symptom of his deep unhappiness with his destiny. He wanted a life of personal freedom that simply couldn't exist with the job of a king. The world saw a dashing Prince Charming, but his family and the government saw a man who was running from his responsibilities, a man who preferred nightclubs and parties to state papers and official duties. He was a jazz-age prince about to inherit a medieval institution. The stage was set for a massive collision. All it needed was a catalyst, and that catalyst was about to arrive in the form of an American woman who was, in every way possible, the most unsuitable partner for a future king. Her name was Wallis Warfield, born Bessie Wallace Warfield in Blue Ridge Summit, Pennsylvania in 1896. History, though, would know her simply as Wallis Simpson. She wasn't a princess, not an aristocrat, and she wasn't even British. She was an American commoner, and that fact alone was a major hurdle for the class-obsessed British establishment. But her nationality was the least of her so-called problems. Wallis's life was a world away from the palaces and privilege that defined Edward's. Her father died when she was just a baby, leaving her and her mother to depend on the charity of wealthy relatives. This taught her to be tough, determined, and ambitious to make her own way in the world. She was sharp, witty, and had a commanding presence that people found magnetic. She wasn't a classical beauty, but she had this incredible style and a confidence that just drew people in. By the time she met the Prince of Wales, Wallis had been married not once, but twice. Her first husband was a U.S. Navy pilot, a marriage that was turbulent and ended in divorce. In 1928, she married Ernest Simpson, an American-born British shipping executive, and moved to London. It was through him that she started moving in high society circles and eventually ended up in the Prince of Wales's orbit. To the royal court and the British government, Wallis Simpson was everything they feared. An American, a commoner, and most damningly of all, a divorcee who, by 1936, was about to get her second divorce. In their eyes, she was a social climber, an adventuress with questionable morals. Rumors and police reports, some probably exaggerated, painted a picture of a woman driven by a love for money and status, not real love for the future king. Fair or not, this became an unbreakable wall of opposition. She wasn't just unsuitable. To them, she was unthinkable as a potential queen. You might think their first meeting in 1931 was something out of a storybook, but it was actually pretty unremarkable. Wallis and her husband, Ernest, were last-minute guests at a house party. The prince was there with his mistress at the time, Lady Furness. Wallis later said she was petrified and wasn't all that impressed with the prince, but a connection was made. Over the next couple of years, the Simpsons became regulars in the prince's social circle. What charmed Edward was Wallis's total lack of reverence. Unlike the gushing young women and respectful courtiers he was used to, Wallis treated him like a man, not a future king. She teased him, wasn't impressed by his title, and held her own in conversation. For a prince who felt smothered by his role, this was like a breath of fresh air. In her, he found an escape and a confidant who gave him a taste of a more normal life. By 1934, their friendship had become a full-blown affair. Edward was completely infatuated, showering Wallis with money and spectacular jewelry from places like Cartier. He wasn't just in love, he was obsessed. He dropped his other mistresses and devoted himself completely to her. Wallis, for her part, was now the center of attention for the most famous man in the world. Inside their elite circle, the affair was an open secret. But to the British public, they had no idea. The royal family was horrified. King George V and Queen Mary were disgusted by their son's relationship and refused to ever receive Wallis at court. Behind the scenes, the government was getting nervous. The police were even assigned to monitor the couple, their reports detailing the prince's obsession and the storm that was brewing. The prince, however, seemed not to notice, or maybe he just didn't care. He was in love, convinced he'd finally found the one person on earth who truly got him. In his letters, he called her his perfect woman and talked about how miserable he was without her. He was ready to give up everything for her, and soon he'd be asked to do just that. On January 20th, 1936, the old world ended. King George V died, and the Prince of Wales became King Edward VIII. What had been a private scandal was now a full-blown constitutional crisis. The stakes were suddenly sky-high. He wasn't just David, the rebellious prince, anymore. He was His Majesty the King, and he was determined to marry Wallis Simpson. That summer, Wallis filed for divorce from her husband, making her intentions crystal clear. Edward then told his Prime Minister, Stanley Baldwin, that he planned to marry her as soon as her divorce was final, and if he couldn't, he was ready to abdicate. The government was thrown into chaos. Prime Minister Baldwin, a man of old-school tradition, made it clear that this marriage was impossible on several grounds. First, there was the religious problem. As king, Edward was the head of the Church of England, which at the time absolutely did not allow a person to remarry if their divorced spouse was still alive. Wallis had 2 living ex-husbands. For the king, the defender of the faith, to marry her would be a slap in the face to the Church's own rules. The Archbishop of Canterbury said it was morally and theologically impossible. Second, there was the political crisis. Baldwin told the king the government would resign if he went ahead with the marriage. He also checked with the leaders of Canada, Australia, and South Africa, who were all against it too. If the king ignored the advice of his government, it would spark a war between the Crown and Parliament, threatening the stability of the entire British Empire. Finally, there was the simple social objection. The idea of an American twice-divorced commoner becoming queen was just offensive to many people at the time. She was seen as an untrustworthy outsider. For months, the British press had a gentleman's agreement to keep the story quiet at home, but the American and European papers were having a field day with stories about the King and Queen Wallis. When the news finally broke in Britain in early December 1936, the public was stunned. Edward had one last desperate idea: a morganatic marriage. It was a long shot, but common in other parts of Europe. He could marry Wallis, but she wouldn't become queen, and their children couldn't inherit the throne. A simple compromise, right? Wrong. Baldwin and the cabinet flatly rejected it, saying it wasn't even possible under British law. They gave the king a final choice: Wallis or the throne. There was no third option. He was completely cornered, with no allies left to fight for him. Those last few days were an absolute whirlwind of pressure and heartbreak. King Edward VIII, on the throne for less than a year, was totally alone. The government wouldn't budge, his family was begging him to give Wallis up, and the country was in shock. He wanted to plead his case to the people over the radio, but even that was denied by the Prime Minister. Faced with dragging his country into a political war and tearing the monarchy apart, Edward finally accepted it was over. He had to choose, and really, for him, was it ever a choice? He chose the woman he loved. On December 10, 1936, at his home, Fort Belvedere, King Edward VIII signed the official abdication papers. His three brothers, including the next king, stood by as witnesses. The document was stark and final. I, Edward VIII, do hereby declare my irrevocable determination to renounce the throne for myself and for my descendants. Just like that, he became the only British monarch to ever voluntarily give up the crown. His reign had lasted just 327 days. The next evening, December 11th, he wasn't a king anymore. The BBC introduced him simply as His Royal Highness Prince Edward. He finally got to speak for himself, broadcasting a speech from Windsor Castle to the entire world. At long last, I am able to say a few words of my own, he began. You all know the reasons which have impelled me to renounce the throne, but you must believe me when I tell you that I have found it impossible to carry the heavy burden of responsibility and to discharge my duties as king as I would wish to do without the help and support of the woman I love. He made it clear the decision was his and his alone, and even said Wallis had tried up to the last to persuade me to take a different course. He ended with a wish for his brother, the new King George VI, and a simple, God save the king. A few hours later, he left England and sailed into exile, never to truly come home again. Edward's abdication sent a shockwave through the monarchy. His younger brother, Albert, a shy man with a stammer who never wanted to be king, was suddenly King George VI. This unexpected twist meant that his eldest daughter, Elizabeth, was now next in line for the throne. A single choice made in 1936 directly paved the way for the historic 70-year reign of Queen Elizabeth II. Edward was given the new title Duke of Windsor by his brother. In June 1937, once Wallis's divorce was final, they married in a small ceremony in France. None of his family came. In a move that would sting Edward for the rest of his life, the new king granted him the title His Royal Highness, but pointedly refused to grant it to his wife. Wallis would be the Duchess of Windsor, but never Her Royal Highness. It was a royal snub that would last a lifetime. The Duke and Duchess of Windsor spent the rest of their lives as celebrity exiles, mostly in France. They were famous for their lavish lifestyle, but they were always on the outside looking in when it came to the royal family. Their reputation was stained forever by a disastrous visit to Nazi Germany in 1937, where the Duke was photographed meeting Adolf Hitler. They were a couple defined by the scandal that brought them together. Edward remained bitter about his exile and how his wife was treated, while Wallis lived a life of glamorous isolation. They were devoted to each other until Edward's death from cancer in 1972. He was buried near Windsor Castle, and when Wallis died 14 years later, she was buried right beside him, finally getting a place in the royal fold in death that she was always denied in life. The story of Edward and Wallis is a powerful reminder of how one personal choice can change the world. It's a timeless drama of love versus duty, of modern desires clashing with ancient rules. If you love incredible stories from history where a single decision changed everything, make sure you subscribe and hit that notification bell so you never miss what's next. The question that hangs over this entire story is, was it worth it? Would you give up an empire for love? Edward VIII made a choice no other British monarch ever has. He chose his own happiness over his birthright, a decision that cost him his crown, his country, and his family's respect. But in doing so, he may have actually saved the monarchy from a king who was a bad fit for the job. His sacrifice, born from a forbidden love, passed the crown to his more dutiful brother, and then to his niece, Queen Elizabeth II. Their legacy is a paradox, a story of incredible personal devotion and huge public failure. It's a romance that, by ending a king's reign, may have accidentally saved the future of the British throne for generations to come.